The vast prairie sky, a sheet of pale, endless blue, stretched over the land as if God himself had pressed it flat with a great, gentle hand. Below it, the world was a picture of quiet industry, a small ranch clinging to the earth like a stubborn, beautiful weed. This was the home of Hope, a young woman whose spirit had once been as wide and open as that very sky. But now, a shadow lived inside her, a quiet companion to the cheerful sun. It had been a year, a long, slow turn of the seasons, since the letter arrived. The paper, now ashes in the stove, had held words that broke her world. The young man who had promised her the moon and the stars had written only of gold and distant mountains, his love for her clearly not as strong as his love for the dream of a quick fortune. He was gone, and he had taken a piece of her heart with him, the piece that believed in promises. On that day, standing in the dusty yard with her mother Martha's arm around her, Hope had made a promise of her own. "Never again," she had whispered, her voice thick with a hurt that felt like a physical sickness. "I will never love a man again. It is a risk that only ends in pain." Martha, a woman whose face was lined with the wisdom of years spent trusting in the Lord's plan, had simply held her daughter tighter, saying nothing. She knew some storms had to be weathered alone. Hope threw herself into her work. She tended the chickens, their frantic clucking a familiar sound. She helped her father, Benjamin, a strong man whose own strength was now being tested by a back that ached with a persistent, grinding pain. She baked bread until her hands were dusty with flour, trying to knead the memory of that smiling, unfaithful face out of her mind. She was helpful, she was capable, but the laughter that used to ring across the property was now a rare and fleeting thing, like a sudden ray of sun on a cloudy day. Then came the storm. It rolled in from the west one evening, a great churning monster of purple cloud and howling wind. The family huddled inside their sturdy wooden house, listening to the rage of the world outside. The wind screamed like a living thing, and the rain fell not in drops but in sheets, lashing against the windows. The next morning the world was washed clean and battered. The air smelled of wet earth and broken branches. And the fence, the long, meandering line of wood that kept their small herd of cattle safe, was a disaster. A great section of it was smashed flat, posts snapped like twigs, the wire tangled and useless. The cattle, confused and nervous, milled about at the edge of the ruin, sensing their freedom. Benjamin stood at the edge of the damage, his broad shoulders slumped. He placed a hand on his lower back, a gesture of deep worry that Hope saw from the kitchen window. He could not fix this alone. Not with his back the way it was. It would take weeks of hard back-breaking labor. The next day he saddled his old horse and rode towards town, returning hours later with a stranger. Hope watched from the porch as the man rode in. He sat tall in the saddle but not proudly. It was a comfortable, easy tallness, as if he and the horse were one creature. He was a cowboy, that much was clear from his worn boots and his dusty hat, pulled low over his eyes. He was young, perhaps a few years older than her, but his face in the shadow of his hat brim was serious and still. He didn't say much as her father introduced him. His name was Samuel. He needed work and Benjamin needed a strong back. It was a simple arrangement. Samuel took a room in the bunkhouse, a small, dusty building that had stood empty for a long time. The next morning, as the sun was just painting the horizon with color, he was already at the fence. Hope, starting her own morning chores, could hear the steady, rhythmic sounds of his work. The solid thump of the mallet driving a new post into the earth. The creak of wire being pulled taut. She was determined to pay him no mind. He was just a hired hand, a man passing through. She would be polite, as her mother had taught her to be to all of God's creatures, but that was all. She brought him a cup of water at midday, setting it on a post without a word, retreating back to the safety of the house before he could do more than nod his thanks. She saw his eyes, a calm and steady shade of brown, and looked away. She had promised herself, and she intended to keep that promise, guarding her wounded heart behind a fence of her own making, one she was determined would never be broken down. The rhythm of the ranch changed with Samuel's presence. The sun did not rise or set any differently, but the sounds that filled the days were new. The steady, patient thump, thump, thump of the mallet became the ranch's new heartbeat, a slow and persistent drumming that seemed to push back against the vast silence of the prairie. Hope moved through her own chores with a practiced efficiency, a silent dancer in a ballet she knew by heart, all the while aware of the quiet, steady force working at the edge of their land. She was determined to maintain her distance, to see Samuel as little more than a tool, like the mallet he swung, useful but without a story, without a soul she needed to know. Her first line of defense was simple avoidance. She timed her trips to the henhouse for when he was at the farthest end of the fence line. She took the long way around the barn to get to the vegetable garden, adding precious minutes to her work but preserving the solitude of her heart. Yet, the ranch was only so big and some intersections were unavoidable. The water pump, for instance, stood in the yard between the house and the broken fence. One afternoon, struggling with a heavy bucket filled to the brim, the water sloshing over the sides and soaking her dress, she felt a presence beside her. Samuel did not speak. He simply reached out, his large, work-roughened hands taking the handle from her own. His touch was brief and impersonal, but the act itself was so quietly decisive that it left her speechless. He carried the bucket to the kitchen steps, set it down with a soft thud, gave a slight tip of his hat, and returned to his work without a single word. Hope stood there, the cool water seeping into her shoes, feeling a strange flutter of something she could not name, not annoyance but a bewildering sense of being seen. Mealtimes became another quiet battlefield. Samuel would wash up at the pump outside before coming to the back door, always removing his hat before stepping into the kitchen. He was a man of few words, answering her father Benjamin's questions about the work with short, direct sentences. Posts are set deep, he might say. Wires holding. But it was what he did before he ate that caught Hope's attention most. As her mother Martha brought the food to the table, Samuel would bow his head, his hands resting quietly on the edge of the worn wooden table. He did not offer a long, showy prayer, but his silence, his clear moment of thanks, held a weight that words sometimes lacked. It was a faith that was not worn on his sleeve but woven into the very fabric of his being, as natural to him as breathing. One evening, as Hope was collecting eggs, she heard a familiar, troubling creak from the porch. It was the loose board by the top step, the one her father had been meaning to fix for weeks but his back always protested the bending. The next morning as she stepped outside, the creak was gone. She looked down. The board was firm and secure, nailed down with fresh, sturdy nails. She knew without having to ask whose hands had done the work. He had not been asked. He had not announced his intention. He had simply seen something that needed mending and had mended it. This quiet kindness was a language she did not know how to speak, and it confused her more than any flowery compliment ever could. Her mother Martha seemed to notice the shift in the air, the tiny cracks appearing in Hope's defensive walls. As they shelled peas on the porch one afternoon, the sound of Samuel's mallet a steady accompaniment, Martha spoke softly, her eyes on her busy hands. "A man's character," she began, her voice as calm as the late afternoon light, "is often found not in the grand speeches he makes, but in the small tasks he completes without expecting a reward. Some men," she continued, placing a handful of shelled peas into the bowl, "they talk of building castles in the sky. Others, they are content to simply build a strong fence or fix a loose step, because they know that real life is built on things that are solid and true." Hope said nothing, but her hands stilled their work. She looked out towards the fence, where Samuel was straining to pull a long section of wire taut, the muscles in his arms corded with the effort. He was not building a castle. He was rebuilding something her family needed to survive. The promise she had made to herself, that vow born of pain, suddenly felt like a heavy, ill-fitting coat on a warm day. It was a protection she had thought she needed, but now she wondered if it was also keeping out the light. She watched him work, this quiet man of faith and few words, and for the first time since the letter, a small, fragile question began to grow in her heart. What if a promise made in fear was not a promise at all, but a prison? The final post was set, the last strand of wire pulled tight and stapled firmly into place. The fence stood now not as a broken line of defeat, but as a strong, defiant boundary against the wild, a testament to weeks of patient, sun-baked labor. The work was done, and with its completion, a quiet anxiety began to bloom within Hope. The rhythm of Samuel's presence had become a part of her days, a steady certainty as reliable as the sunrise. The end of the fence meant the end of his reason for being here. Soon he would saddle his horse, collect his wages and ride out of their lives, becoming just another memory on the long, dusty road. The thought settled in her stomach like a cold stone, and she found herself watching him even more closely, trying to memorize the quiet way he moved, the respectful dip of his head when her mother spoke. The morning after the last nail was driven, Hope saw her father and Samuel talking in low, serious tones near the barn. Benjamin's hand was on Samuel's shoulder, a gesture of surprising familiarity. Her heart gave a painful lurch. This was it. He was saying his goodbyes. She turned quickly, pretending to be utterly engrossed in watching the chickens peck at the ground, her back to the scene, not wanting to witness his departure. She heard footsteps approach the house, firm and steady on the hard-packed earth. She braced herself for the sound of a saddle being cinched, for the creak of leather as he mounted his horse. But the footsteps did not go to the hitching post. Instead they came onto the porch. She heard the soft knock on the front door, and her mother's voice welcoming him inside. Confusion swirled within her. Why was he coming into the house? Perhaps he was just collecting his final pay. Minutes stretched into an eternity. Hope could not focus on her chores. She rearranged the same jars on the kitchen shelf 3 times, her ears straining for any sound from the front room. Finally, the door to the kitchen opened, and her mother Martha entered, her eyes shining with a light Hope had not seen in a long time. "Hope," Martha said, her voice soft but full of emotion. "Samuel would like a word with you." On the porch. Hope's hands felt suddenly cold. A word? What word could he possibly have for her? A simple farewell? She wiped her hands on her apron, her heart hammering a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She walked slowly to the front of the house, her legs feeling as though they were made of wood. Samuel was standing at the edge of the porch, his hat held in his hands, turning the brim round and round in a slow, nervous motion. He turned as she approached, and his eyes, those calm, steady brown eyes, met hers. For a long moment, he simply looked at her, as if gathering his thoughts, gathering his courage. The silence was not uncomfortable, but thick with unspoken meaning. "Hope," he began, his voice low and earnest. "I have spoken with your father. And I have his blessing to speak to you." He took a small, hesitant step closer. "The fence is mended. My work here, the work I was paid for, is done. But my heart has found a new kind of work it wants to do." Hope could only stare, her breath caught in her throat. Samuel continued, his gaze never wavering. "I know you carry a hurt. I see it in your eyes, a shadow that should not be there in someone so good. I am not a man of many words, Hope. I cannot promise you a life of riches or a path without stones. The world is hard and the land demands much. But what I can promise you before God, who is my witness, is my faithfulness. I promise you my strong hands to work for you, my loyal heart to cherish you, and my faith to guide us, for all the days the Lord gives me on this earth." Tears welled in Hope's eyes, but they were not tears of the old, familiar pain. They were tears of a overwhelming, terrifying hope. The wall around her heart, the one she had built so carefully, felt as though it were shaking at its very foundation. "Samuel, she whispered, her voice trembling. "I made a promise, to myself. After what happened. I said I would never." Her words failed her. Samuel nodded slowly, his expression full of a deep, patient understanding. "I know," he said softly. "And a promise is a sacred thing. But a promise, Hope, a promise that is made in the darkness, a promise born of pain and fear. I do not believe the Lord intends for such a promise to chain a heart forever. I believe He sends new mornings to heal the wounds of the night." He took another step, close enough now that she could see the honest plea in his eyes. "I am not asking you to break your promise this very moment. I'm only asking you to walk with me. To let me court you properly with your family's blessing. To let me show you day by day that my word is as strong as that fence out there. Let me show you that some promises are meant to be kept for a lifetime." The last of her defenses crumbled, not with a loud crash, but with a quiet, gentle sigh, like a weight she had been carrying for far too long finally being lifted. The fear did not vanish, but it was suddenly overshadowed by a brighter, stronger feeling, a feeling that felt suspiciously like faith. She looked at this good, quiet man, who asked for nothing but a chance, and she saw a future she had dared not dream of. A slow, tentative smile touched her lips, the first true, unburdened smile she had felt in a year. She nodded, a single, decisive motion. "I would like that," she said, her voice gaining strength. "I would like to walk with you, Samuel." And in that moment, under the wide, watchful prairie sky, a new and more beautiful promise began, not from a place of fear, but from the first fragile seeds of a love built on faith. The walks became the anchor of their days, a sacred ritual as regular as the setting of the sun. As the last golden light of afternoon began to stretch the shadows long across the land, Samuel would finish any small chores he had taken on for Benjamin, mending a harness, reinforcing the barn door, and would wait for Hope by the gate. There was no grand gesture, no offering of flowers, just his quiet, steady presence, a silent question asked and answered anew each evening. At first, their walks were short, a simple loop around the perimeter of the home pasture, the conversation as careful and tentative as the steps of a newborn foal. He spoke of his childhood on a ranch to the north, of losing his parents young and learning to rely on his own hands and his faith in God's plan. She, in turn, began to share little pieces of her own story, not the painful ending but the happy middle, the joy of baking with her mother, the way her father had taught her to read the weather in the clouds. With each passing evening, the path they walked grew a little longer, venturing down to the creek where the cottonwood trees whispered secrets in the breeze, their conversations deepening like the roots of those old trees. Hope found herself laughing, a real, genuine laugh that startled her with its own sound. She discovered the dry, subtle humor that lay beneath Samuel's quiet exterior, a wit that revealed itself in a clever turn of phrase or a gently teasing observation. He listened to her, truly listened, his whole attention focused on her words as if they were the most important thing in the world. The ghost of the man who had left her began to fade, its power over her dimming with every shared silence, every respectful glance. The promise she had clutched so tightly now felt less like a shield and more like a chain she was gently, willingly, allowing to fall away. The proposal came on an evening when the air was soft and sweet with the scent of wild clover. They were standing by the creek, watching the water swirl around the smooth, gray stones. Samuel turned to her, taking both of her hands in his. His face was serious, but his eyes were alight with a fierce and tender hope. "Hope," he said, his voice firm and clear. "Walking with you has been the greatest joy of my life. My heart has found its home here with you. I'm asking you to let me build a life with you. Will you do me the profound honor of becoming my wife?" There were no lengthy speeches needed. The answer had been growing in her heart for weeks, nurtured by his kindness and his unwavering faith. "Yes," she whispered, her eyes shining with happy tears. "Yes, Samuel. I will." The news was met with quiet, profound joy by Benjamin and Martha. Preparations for the wedding were not elaborate, but they were filled with a deep, abiding happiness. Martha brought out her own wedding dress from a carved wooden trunk, and with careful, loving stitches, she and Hope altered it to fit Hope's slimmer frame. Benjamin, his back seemingly less troubled by the sheer force of his happiness, worked with Samuel to build a small, sturdy addition to the main house, a private room for the new couple, a testament to the new family taking root within the old walls. The wedding day dawned clear and bright, the sky a perfect, cloudless blue. The small town church, with its simple wooden pews and sunlit windows, was filled with the warm faces of neighbors and friends. Hope walked down the short aisle on her father's arm, her heart feeling so full she thought it might burst. She saw Samuel waiting for her at the front, standing tall and straight in a clean, simple suit, his eyes fixed on her with a look of such pure, reverent love that it took her breath away. They spoke their vows before God and their community, their voices steady and sure. They promised to love and to cherish, for better or for worse, in sickness and in health, till death alone would part them. The pastor spoke of the strength of a threefold cord, of how a marriage built with God at its center could not be easily broken. As Samuel placed a simple gold band on her finger, Hope knew with a certainty that settled deep in her soul that this was not an ending, but the true beginning of her life. After a joyful celebration with cake and lemonade on the church lawn, they returned to the ranch, to the home they would now share with her parents. Life settled into a new and beautiful rhythm. Samuel officially became a partner in the ranch, his strength and knowledge a perfect complement to Benjamin's experience. Hope kept house with her mother, the two women now companions in a new way. In the evenings, Samuel and Hope would still take their walk, but now his hand would hold hers, not in courtship, but in the settled, sure possession of marriage. It was on one of these walks, a few months later, that Hope stopped, placing a hand on her stomach, a dawning, wondrous realization lighting her features. She looked at Samuel, her eyes wide with a mixture of awe and joy. "Samuel," she whispered, I believe the Lord is going to bless us with a child." His face, usually so reserved, broke into a smile of such radiant, overwhelming joy that it seemed to illuminate the gathering dusk. They held each other there, in the middle of their land, under the vast, star-dusted sky, their prayers of thanks a silent, joyful song rising from their grateful hearts. The seasons turned in their gentle, unending cycle, and the ranch, once a place shadowed by a past hurt, now thrived with a palpable sense of peace and purpose. Hope's pregnancy was a time of quiet preparation and joyful anticipation. Martha's hands, now a little more gnarled with age, were never still, knitting tiny socks and sewing soft blankets from leftover fabric. Benjamin, with a grandfather's proud gleam in his eye, worked alongside Samuel in the evenings to craft a sturdy cradle from seasoned oak, the rhythmic scrape of their tools a happy sound from the barn. Samuel's care for Hope was a constant, tender presence. He would bring her a cool drink without her asking, his hand resting gently on her shoulder as he passed, his prayers over their meals holding a new, deeper layer of gratitude for the blessing they were about to receive. The love between them, which had started as a fragile, hesitant seed, had now grown deep roots and strong branches, weathering its first seasons together. The day the baby decided to come was a day of hushed urgency and fervent prayer. A neighbor was sent riding for the doctor in town, but the distance was great. Inside the small room Samuel and Benjamin had built, with the late afternoon light filtering through the window, Hope labored, surrounded by the steadfast presence of her mother and the quiet, calming prayers of the women from the nearby church who had come to help. Samuel waited outside on the porch, his usual calm replaced by a restless energy, his knuckles white as he gripped the railing, his gaze fixed on the horizon where the doctor would appear. Each muffled cry from within the house felt like a physical blow, and he prayed as he had never prayed before, not for himself, but for the safety of his wife and the child he had not yet met. The wait felt like an eternity, a slow march of shadows across the yard. Then, as the first stars began to prick the deep violet of the evening sky, a new sound pierced the stillness. It was not a cry of pain but a strong, healthy, indignant wail. The door to the house opened, and Martha stood there, her face etched with exhaustion but radiant with a pure, triumphant joy. "Samuel," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "Come and meet your son." He moved as if in a dream, stepping into the warm, lamplit room. Hope lay on the bed, her face pale but shining with a serene and powerful light, a light of victory and of a love so profound it seemed to fill the entire space. In her arms, swaddled tightly in one of the soft, new blankets, was a tiny, perfect human being, his face still red and crumpled from the journey, his mouth a tiny rosebud. Samuel knelt beside the bed, his large, work-worn hand trembling as he reached out to gently touch his son's impossibly small fist. The baby's fingers, with a strength that surprised him, curled instinctively around one of his father's rough fingers. In that moment, a love so fierce and overwhelming flooded Samuel's heart that tears, unbidden and unashamed, welled in his eyes and traced clean paths through the dust on his cheeks. He looked at Hope and no words were needed. All the promises he had made, of faithfulness, of a life built together, of trust in God, were made real and tangible in the tiny breathing miracle she held. Hope smiled, a tired, blissful smile. "His name is Samuel," she whispered, her voice soft but clear. "We will call him Little Sam." It was a name that spoke of honor, of legacy, and of a future written not in the pain of the past, but in the faithful promises of the present. Weeks turned into months and little Sam grew, his presence a daily source of wonder. The ranch was filled with new sounds, the soft coos from the cradle on the porch, the lullabies Hope would sing as she rocked him, the deep, rumbling sound of Samuel's voice as he would talk to his son about the horses and the clouds. One evening, after the supper dishes were cleared and the golden light of sunset washed over the land, the family gathered on the porch. Benjamin sat in his favorite rocking chair, a contented smile on his face as he watched Martha gently sway with a sleeping little Sam in her arms. Hope sat next to Samuel on the porch steps, leaning her head against his strong shoulder, his arm wrapped securely around her. They looked out across their land, their gaze falling upon the long, strong line of the mended fence, standing silent and vigilant in the twilight. It was more than just wood and wire now, it was a symbol of their journey. Hope tilted her head back to look up at her husband's face, his profile outlined against the darkening sky. "You know," she said softly, her voice full of a quiet, profound certainty. "You didn't just fix our fence that summer. You mended my heart." Samuel looked down at her, his eyes holding a lifetime of love and devotion. He squeezed her shoulder gently. "And you, my dear Hope," he replied, his voice a low, warm rumble. "You gave my quiet life its greatest joy, its deepest meaning." They sat there together, the three generations, a living testament to the truth that a heart shattered by betrayal can be healed by a faithful love, that a promise made to God is a foundation that cannot be shaken, and that sometimes, the most beautiful blessings begin with a broken fence and a quiet, answering prayer. Their story is a reminder that even in the wild and untamed places of our lives, hope and faith can build a love that lasts forever. If you enjoyed this story of faith, love, and redemption on the prairie, we have many more tales to share. Subscribe to our channel so you never miss a journey back to a time where promises were kept and love was built to last a lifetime.